Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. Hope you are having a wonderful start to your weekend as we are entering into June, which hopefully that means warmer weather. I know that sounds weird, but in Ohio, it has been cold and rainy, and even times where it's gotten so cold, some people even had to turn their heat back on in May. So that's kind of the reality for at least for us and me in Central Ohio. What about you, Micah, down in Southwest Ohio? How's the weather been for you?
It's been about the same, man. We cherish those days of actual sunshine
Yeah.
and warmer weather, like in the 70s. Like I'm like, where the heck has spring been? And I know that spring isn't just, sunshine and mild temperatures, but like, it's a lot of, rain and we need a lot of rain for things to grow and things like that. But like, I mean, come on now. Like June is like this weekend and it's like, what's my phone say? It's 56 degrees right now and it's raining outside my window. So,
It's
um,
not raining here, but it's about 50, about somewhere around in the mid 50s here. It's not raining, but it's overcast. It's still wet because it rained like overnight.
yeah, and so like I did watch the weather this morning and they did say we were trending towards the 80s next week, which I'm like, "Oh, we're all gonna like we're all gonna like fry because it's gonna
Yeah,
be
we go
such
from freezing to death to frying to death.
it's gonna be such a complete opposite or contrast to what we're dealing with or what we've been dealing with." And I also read too that like this year since January,
Hmm.
we have had the most rain on record in the state of Ohio.
Crazy, man.
So, it's wild.
Oh man. Well, today we're not going to be talking about the weather today. We're actually going to be talking about a topic which I think is kind of in some ways maybe a little strange, maybe it may be relevant, but the topic is how is it that some people they go to church, they want to get plugged in, they want to get involved, they want to serve, and yet for some reason they're just not willing to volunteer because they're either not asked to, or maybe church leadership or the pastor basically tells them that they can't serve. And the reason why I say that's kind of weird because I know being a pastor of small churches in the past, like sometimes you're struggling, you want people to volunteer. So if there's somebody who says, I want to volunteer, it's like, yes, I will take anybody at this point to help volunteer. But sometimes people experience the opposite where they want to volunteer and and for some reason they just can't, and we don't, and sometimes there's a reason, sometimes there's no reason. So Micah, kind of tell me a little bit in your experience. Have you ever experienced something where you go to a church and they need volunteers, you volunteer and they're like yes, and then have you ever been in a part where you as a worship leader have asked for volunteers and struggled? And have you even, and I guess the third thing is, have you ever been in a position where you wanted to volunteer and you just can't because you're just not given the opportunity to volunteer?
Yeah, so yes to all three. Um, what was the first one again?
um the first one's just more of like being in a smaller church and like,
Sure.
and trying to be volunteering at a smaller church. Like, did you ever feel like you were turned down from trying to volunteer like in a really small church?
It's kind of
Maybe.
funny. It's been the opposite for me because it's like, you know, like you said, Scott, like at smaller churches, it's like open season, right? Like if you can get volunteers, like, oh, we can play, or that person can play. What do they play? They play drums. Well, great. Let's let them play drums. Hey, this person plays bass. Let's get them, involved. And this person plays keys, etc. Um, I will say too that like I've worked at mid-sized churches where I've had a steady team, worship team wise, um, that love to volunteer, love to play every week, but yet I get a lot of pressure from my staff, pastor, and elders saying we need more volunteers, we need more numbers, we need more volunteers, we need more numbers. But it's like, well, if the positions are being filled and the needs are being met, yes, we need more volunteers. Yes, we need backups. Yes, we need to continue to grow our ministries. But if I don't have musicians in the church, what am I supposed to do about that? Um, but I've also been involved in bigger and larger churches where we've had, 3 and 4 deep in each slot, meaning we have 3 or 4 musicians that play guitar, 3 or 4 musicians that play
Hmm.
bass, drums, and sing, and we have 4 different worship teams. And so basically they're playing once a month. And if they wanted to serve in another area of ministry, like, children's ministry or whatever, um, they can do so. However, um, sometimes it's just not possible. And then finally, thirdly, it's just, I think yes to your question about walking into a situation ministry wise where, you know, I know that I've experienced this in the last year, year and a half, 2 years, where I've walked into churches, um, and people know who I am. People know that I have a skill set. People know that I've led worship at, churches all over the place and, you know, can offer great uh advice and or help to an existing worship team or building a worship team. But yet it seems that, I just sit there and I never get asked to do something.
Hmm.
And it's I've yet to figure out why that is. Um, and like before we hit record, it's like, oh, I've talked to these pastors, and I'm like, well, I would love to get involved. I'd love to get, love to serve, love to get involved, love to serve. But then when, I try to do so, it's like, are you going to let me, or are you going to ask me, or um,
Yeah.
and then it's like, but then I'm just disengaged and don't really want to be involved in the first place. Um, yeah, so like I've really been struggling with that over the last couple of years because it's like, now there's been a couple of times, granted, where a church is like, hey, can you come in and lead and do a couple of songs because our person's out and they don't have a big church, they don't have a big worship team or anything like that, but they have a need, and I'm like, sure, absolutely. Um, or somebody's worship leader's throwing up at 9:30 on Sunday and church starts at 10. We need you to come in and help. Sure, absolutely, I'll be there. Um, but back to the other, it's just a mystery to me. Have you encountered anything like that before?
Yeah. So there's been times, actually twice, and actually this happened when I was in this is when I was in college at Anderson. There was a time where, I was going to, or actually the first time it happened was I was on campus and there was a organization called Vision Revision, which was kind of like a worship arts program where students would get together and we'd have like there'd be like 1 or 2 like chapel services where we would do some type of thing, whether music, art, theater, whatever. And then again, a theater major. I'm like, oh, I'll sign up for this. So I was interested. They had these cards. If you're interested, I signed up. I checked. Here's my information. Here's how you can contact me. Did a check mark that I'm interested in vision revision. Put it through the campus mail slot like I was told to do. Um, and never got a call. Submitted some stuff again, saying I'm interested. Never got a call. Never anything. And it was like, okay, you kind of were like, okay, either A, their system of trying to recruit people is flawed, or B, they just don't want me, but I never know. So I just kind of like was done. Um, and then eventually, we were attending North Anderson Church of God, which is where Jim Lyons was the pastor at that time before it became whatever they moved
Madison Park.
to Madison Park. Yeah, before it came Madison Park, it's North Anderson. And again, oh, we're glad you're here. So I signed a little welcome card to say that I'm here. Here's my information. And, just even put like I'm a college student, I'm a, Bible student at Anderson, also a theater major at Anderson, would like to volunteer, would like to be plugged into the church. Turn in my card, they get my card, they go, oh, hey, here's your gift bag or whatnot. They look at my card, they go, oh, okay, when to serve, we'll get in touch with you. Like, okay, and nothing. And I mean, in both of those situations, you're like larger organizations, a university and a large church. But there's also that part of me that goes, you know, is it a mega church issue? But I also know people and friends of mine who go to like mid-sized churches to small churches who would like to volunteer, like to be a part of stuff. And it's like they don't. They don't get asked, or if they do ask, they're said, oh, well, we want to make sure you get the right job. Or sometimes the opposite happens. They do serve, but then you have like 15 people serving in this one capacity, and everyone just kind of, and you get to the point where it's so overwhelmed and there's too many cooks in the kitchen, so to say, that you just kind of get turned off because it's like, well, I guess they don't need me because there's like 12 other people doing the same thing. So you kind of get into that headspace in some ways. So with that being said, what do you think the issue is in your own? What do you think the issue is from, in your opinion, or your thoughts?
I mean, it could be a couple things. Um, the first thing that comes to mind is uh, territorialness.
Hmm.
And, even though we have this worship team, or even though we have this team of musicians, we're not changing just because you're coming in. And it's not like you're asking them to change, but it's like they're marking their territory. And so it's
Hmm.
like you got the worship team over here in this little block, Scott, and then you got the pastor over here in his little block on Sunday morning. And the pastor gets up and says, hey, welcome. We're so glad you're here. If you want to get connected, here's how you can get connected. And then it gets lost in the shuffle. I think you can put two and two together.
Yeah.
Um, not saying that happens. I mean, it could, but it's very frustrating because it's like, I mean, you've seen um, small to mid-sized churches that think their worship teams are the absolute bee's knees. When in
Hmm.
reality, if you watched, if you put theirs next to like, I don't know, an elevation or somebody, it's like they've got professional audio engineers on staff who make them sound like $1 million, and they write their own music and they're stellar musicians. And you go back to the small church, granted, there are good musicians at small churches, but it's like, I mean, what are you going to pick? And it's hard not to want to pick and choose and compete for people's attention, but that's kind of where church cultures went these days. And so I I'm just I continue to be frustrated by the conversation of like it's not even like the worship war that we talk about sometimes, or the worship wars that we talk about sometimes
Hmm.
with the early 2000s crossover from traditional to blended to contemporary. It's more of a more of a battle of like attitude,
Hmm.
a battle of soul. And just because somebody wants to join your worship team doesn't mean that they want to take over everything. Maybe
Yeah.
maybe they just want to be a part. Maybe they just want to, maybe they're going through something. Maybe their last church didn't work out because of XYZ. Maybe their last church didn't work out because, you know, they didn't agree with what was going on there. And so they were hurt. And there's a lot of church hurt
Hmm.
that goes along with that. And they just want to find a place where they can belong and be loved and be involved.
Yeah.
And I am just continuing to be amazed that that's an issue in 2025.
Yeah. And, I think with the territorialness, I think a lot of times it can be just, I think in some cases it's bad when someone goes, well, I don't want more people to be part of my project because you take ownership of whatever this ministry is, especially if you are the leader of this volunteer group or whatever this case may be. On the same token, I've seen damage where people do get asked to volunteer, almost kind of like a group project in school where you're in these group projects and there's always that like one person who does everything and you want to try to make input into the process and they just constantly reject your ideas, constantly don't, or they may say, "Oh, that's a good idea," and then they never do it or never implement it. And it's like, well, then why am I here in this ministry setting when everybody is not even taking my ideas or my passions or anything seriously? At least if you think it's a bad idea, say it's a bad idea. Don't just simply ignore it or like sometimes like there'd be times where I bring an idea in the past. I bring an idea and I go, oh well, that doesn't work because we've done that before. And it's like, and then I ask, well, how did you do it? And they say it, and it's like, well, that's not the way I would do it. This is how I would do it to improve it. It's like, ah, no, no. So they go do something else that is still ineffective and doesn't work. Or a lot of times, like especially when it came to vacation Bible school, like I'm very much a big like outreach, let's get the word out in the community, whatnot. And I can remember, and this is the first VBS that I wasn't a part of because I was on vacation like 2 weeks before. So I wasn't had any hands in like picking a theme, setting it up, doing it. I had a team doing it. But I remember in one of the meetings, one of the comp for the person who was going to be the lead on this whole VBS was basically saying, I want to do a VBS for our kids. And I'm thinking, our kids? Like, we're not going to make any type of invitation to community kids. We're not going to make an invitation to, like, what do you mean, our kids? Does that mean like someone's grandmother who kid is goes to a different church? Like, are they allowed to come? Like, it was one of those things where it's just like, okay, I think you kind of missed the point of vacation Bible school, at least in my opinion. I think thought they did, but they did it, and they had their 10 to 12 kids. Where then when me and my wife started to take kind of start taking control of vacation Bible school because the person who was there left the church, um, we're now getting 50, 60, 70 kids coming to VBS because we made it an invitation to the community and even had conversations of, hey, since we help at this missions and there's a bunch of kids who live in this missions in town, why don't we just do a VBS over at the mission for kids? Like instead of doing like a one where we invite people to come, why don't we go and do a VBS at the mission? It'll be smaller, but at least we're impacting kids for the kingdom who have no place to live except for the local mission in our community. Like, and I thought that was a great idea. Um, I think another reason why I think sometimes people aren't asked to volunteer because I think if you're a church that has membership, then I think sometimes that can be a thing too. Like if I'm a visitor and I come to church, let's say I go regularly and I want to volunteer, I'm like, oh, I love this church. I would like to volunteer. I talk to the pastor. There's sometimes where the pastor may explicitly say, well, in order to serve, you have to go through a new member class and be a member of the church, which I think in some cases that's good because at least it shows that you're committed. You're not just here to volunteer. But then there's other places like, the Church of God where our whole philosophy is, well, if you're a Christian, then you're a member of the church. But then, there's always that fine print of, well, you have to be, if you want to vote on anything, you have to at least be here for 6 months. But sometimes I want to know if there's like a time limit, like, oh, you want to volunteer? That's great, but you need to be attending church regularly for 6 months before we even consider you volunteer. And I think if that's the case, if it is, you have to be a member of the church or you have to at least be attending here for a certain amount of time. I feel like if you are a pastor, if you're the volunteer coordinator at your church, you kind of have to make that crystal clear. Here's kind of our rules. Here's kind of our expectations. And then you also have to kind of stick by that because it's going to be kind of, because I can also see, I know of cases where it's like, okay, there's a 6 month waiting list before you can volunteer. You have to be a member, you have to be attending church for 6 months before you can volunteer. But then you may have like a very gifted guitar player coming in, and you're like, man, we really want this person on worship team. So we're just going to go ahead and move them to the front of the line because we want this person to be, you know, part of A team, B team, or C team on worship leaders. Um, and I think that's a very case. But Micah, going to your point that you made earlier, I
Well, what
think
about
sometimes,
hang on a minute. What
yeah.
about somebody who's served in ministry and somebody who's been a pastor and worked in other churches, like you or I, if we were to walk into a church and go through that same thing, and we've been attending a church for a couple of months, we were like it and want to get involved, should we have to go through a new members class? Because the majority of the time, new members stuff is just saying, hey, this is what we believe and why, and are you a Christ follower?
Um, that's a good question. And I think it really depends, Micah, because I mean, if you're a pastor, but let's say, I think of my father-in-law, he goes to a UCC church, um, which I would say is very progressive in their theology. So if I'm a pastor of a Baptist church and I'd say I decide to leave and I want to attend a church that's close by my neighborhood and there's a UCC church, so I go to a UCC church and I'm asking, hey, I want to volunteer. Maybe I want to be like since I'm retired, maybe I want to be a teacher to like an elderly teacher, like a seniors ministry. So then I go take this. So then, here I am sitting in a classroom, and next thing you know, I have a bunch of like same-sex couples coming into the church for Bible study, and yet my theology as a Baptist minister is like, whoa, nah, nah, nah. So then I'm reading the Bible, and I'm now teaching. Well, marriage is between one man, one woman, and now I'm upsetting congregants of this church. Like I do see where even if you're a pastor where a new member class could help, just because if there is a thing of difference in theological views, especially, or even not even theological views, just like church practices or practice views. Like if you're someone who you believe baptisms through immersion and you go to a church where they do sprinkling, is that going to be a deal breaker? Is that something where you say to the pastor, I fundamentally disagree with you sprinkling babies or baptizing babies. So, but I still want to volunteer at your church. Like, then where do I volunteer? Because obviously I can't teach or I can't, like, be a liturgist to kind of help on Sunday mornings because my theology and how that goes into my church practice is different than this denominational views and practices. But if it's something like, I don't know, like greeting people or collecting the offering, do I really need to take a new member class to pass the plates? I don't think so. Do I need to take a new member class to welcome people to church and show them where the service is and show them where the bathrooms is and hand them a bulletin? I don't think so because again, if someone's asking me like, "Hey, what do you believe about what does the church believe about this?" I go, "Well, you know what? You could talk to Pastor. You could talk to Pastor Mike over here. He'll tell you all about it." And I just hand it off. Or you could talk to our associate, or you could talk to another staff member. because they're probably going to know more than me. I'm just a volunteer, and be upfront with them. So I do see that maybe you don't need to, but I also see in some cases, depending on what you're volunteering for, you probably do need to take a new member class just so you can understand the theology, the practice, everything else. Yeah. Um, Now, Micah, going to your earlier point you made about, just plugging in and wanting to serve, I believe that there are people who they get as much out of service or much out of the worship experience of really connecting with God, really, feeling the Holy Spirit like present in their lives and really feel that to a very real degree through service. It's like a spiritual gift. Just like how some people may feel like God is speaking to them sitting in a traditional service with hymns and organs, and someone else can feel God speaking to them through smoke machines and shredding guitars. I think there are some people who thrive by serving. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you laugh about the smoke machines and the shredding guitars, but the reality is like, I mean, I have a student who's helping with like our preschoolers, who's a youth, and basically her calling is to serve, and she's very much loves kids. So there's times where, I even asked her parents, I go, well, hey, she definitely has this gift. I would like her to serve in this capacity because we need help. Is that okay? Or would you rather have her sit in service to listen to the sermon and do this? And they told me, they said, Scott, she would thrive more ministering and teaching the kids about Jesus than sitting in service. And I'm like, okay. And mainly because she also has like ADHD. So her sitting still in a service is going to be torture for her. So the fact that she can be interactive, paint, color, play with kids, teach them about Jesus, do all that, and be a helper for an adult teacher, that's going to help her thrive and that's going to help her grow in her faith. And I think as pastors, as church leaders, we have to recognize that if there's people who want to volunteer, instead of like turning them away or putting a stipulation, ask them why they want to volunteer. And if it's something where you kind of get the sense that, hey, this is a way that they're the type of people who get fed based on service or volunteering for something, and this is going to help them strengthen their faith and strengthen their relationship with God, then that's something you have to say, okay, I'm going to pick this person to volunteer because me having them volunteer and serve in a certain capacity is going to do more for not only help us as a church to be able to have people do things, but it's also going to help that person grow in their faith as well.
Yep. I think that's a good way to look at it too. And people don't talk about that enough. Especially the part where people don't, it may be in people's best interest to serve because they have something like ADHD, or you know, they just need to be doing something while, church is going on. It's better to do that than to cause a huge distraction during a service every week. So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So pastors, people are listening, let us know, like, let us know, like, are you somebody who feels like that you have been neglected in volunteering and serving at a church or Christian organization? We would like to hear your story. Please feel free to send that to us through our website, thescottstedman.com, or you can leave a comment on anywhere you're listening to this podcast. At the same time, maybe you're a church leader or pastor. Maybe you have like a very good reason on why you just don't why sometimes you turn away volunteers or why you tell people that they can't volunteer just yet. Like we would like to kind of know your reasoning or your understanding for that as well. So, friends, thank you so much for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be back on with another episode.
Thank you for
Take
listening to the
care.
Scott Stedman podcast. The Scott Stedman podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman podcast. Thank you so much for listening.